assessments and how to get them.
Well, good morning everyone. I just wanted to give you all a chance to actually go grab a notebook if you did want one. They are at the back. Does anyone want to grab a notebook? Catherine does.
I'll answer that.
Okay, great. Well, as you're aware, we're going to talk about EHC needs assessments first. And in terms of EHC needs assessments, the most important thing is the legal test. So we'll start there. The legal test is your child has or may have special educational needs. And that's part one of the test. And then part two of the test is it may be necessary for special education provision to be made for your child or young person in accordance with an EHC plan. So the key words there are may. So you don't need to have a diagnosis for your child to apply for an EHC plan. If you are giving a description of special educational needs, that's enough. And then the second key word in part two of the test is may be necessary to have special education provision. And how do we know if it's necessary without the EHC needs assessment? But the way to do that is we speak to schools. What's your school done for your child at the moment? And we go from there. So this test, from my first description, clearly has an exceptionally low threshold. So a child or young person has said if they have a learning difficulty or disability which calls for special education provision to be made for them. In terms of a learning difficulty, they might find it significantly greater in terms, sorry, I'm a bit nervous, I don't know why. So I'm going to slow down. So learning difficulty, they have a significantly greater difficulty in learning than most others of the same age. A disability prevents or hinders them from making use of facilities provided by others of the same age in age-group schools or post-16 settings. And SEND provision is educational training for staff or additional provision for your child which is different from that made generally for others of the same age in the mainstream setting. So, evidence for an EHC needs assessment. The key, I would say, evidence, and I find this swings EHC needs assessments requests in a successful direction, is firstly the academic attainment from school. So although a child doesn't need to be behind in school to get an EHC needs assessment, it's often very helpful to show if your child is behind other children in class. We also provide information about the nature, extent and context of the child or young person's special education needs. And we give evidence of the action already taken by the school or nursery. And then if your child has made progress in their school, and perhaps there's not that much of a gap between them and their peers, but to make that progress, the school has put in place provision. Some schools are better than others. It's important to show that in the EHC needs assessment request that your child would not have made this academic progress without the provision you've already received. In terms of evidence for a person's physical, emotional and social development and health needs, we can also give evidence from health professionals and clinicians. So for example, CAMS input, perhaps it's just a visit to the GP, but any kind of medical evidence that we can put together in terms of social, emotional and mental health needs is also very helpful, because sometimes it's not academic, sometimes it's social, emotional and mental health only. Then finally, where a young person is aged over 18, the local authority must consider whether the young person requires additional time in comparison to most others of the same age who do not have special educational needs to complete their educational training. I think that's fantastic. But I've just realised as well, I'm not including on these slides, so please excuse me. There we go. Okay, so EHC needs assessments, common myths. So a common myth, and we hear these excuses a lot from the local authority in terms of their refusal for EHC needs assessment. So the first common myth, a child needs to be academically behind to have an EHC needs assessment. Has anyone in the room been told that? Yeah.
So it's not true.
It's not true, it's a myth. You need an educational psychologist report to apply for an EHC needs assessment. Has anyone been told they need an educational psychologist report before they hit the ground running? A child must have 3 terms worth of assess, plan, do review before a local authority will carry out an EHC needs assessment. Now, assess, plan, do review is one we hear all the time, and it will be one in an EHC needs assessment refusal. Oh, your school hasn't done assess, plan, do review, so we're not going to do an EHC needs assessment. Let them do a couple of terms of assess, plan, do review, and then come back. No, that's wrong. It's incorrect. You need
That comes up a lot with children in reception or year 1, because of course there won't be 3 terms worth. But again, it's just nonsense. It's not true.
You need a diagnosis to apply for an EHC needs assessment. Well, as I've laboured on that point, no, you do not. Only preschool aged / school aged children can have an EHC needs assessment. Has anyone had that myth before? No. Well, in terms of our older children, you can have an EHC plan up until you're 25, which means you can be assessed up until you're 25. The school must spend X amount of extra money on a child before the local authority are required to do an assessment for an EHCP. That's a common myth. Your school does not need to spend anything on your child. Some schools won't. Okay, so EHC needs assessments and the application itself. In terms of your application, it must be in writing. And we suggest in these modern times that we send this application via email and instead of post. The benefit for that is that you can tick read receipt. So if you send by email, the local authority will click yes, I've read this email, and that's evidence that they have in fact received your request. You can find the local authority's email address on their website, but if you're stuck particularly on that part, please pop us an email. We'll be happy to provide the email address for you. You do not need to use the local authority's form. Now, I don't know if anyone's seen the local authority's forms, but they are incredibly long and hard to fill out. They are very difficult. We have a template that we're happy to share at all times, and it's much more simple. Essentially, you just need to say what your child's needs are and whether they've had provision to date. And if they haven't had provision, but you have a professional recommendation for provision, perhaps an autism diagnosis report, you put that in as well, and that's your EHC needs assessment request. Once you've submitted the request, the local authority must issue a decision as to whether to carry out an EHC needs assessment within 6 weeks, and that's from the date that you submitted the request. So as soon as that email is sent off, mark on your calendar 6 weeks from that day, because that's when the local authority must respond to you. If the local authority refused to carry out an EHC needs assessment, and this unfortunately was very common, even if your child has significant needs, we've seen EHC needs assessment requests denied in the first instance. Our advice is to appeal, appeal, appeal. There is a 98% chance of success for parents appealing to the SEND tribunal, so the stats are very high that the SEND tribunal will find in your favour that your child needs an EHC needs assessment. So do not be put off by that first no if it comes.
My experience is that that's what local authorities do almost as a procedure. My experience is that this is not scientific, but about over 90% of applications for EHC assessments will be refused first of all. So a good proportion of parents then go away and say, oh, I haven't gone over the threshold. But actually, if you appeal, the local authority often gives in then because they realise they've got no case, or before any hearing they give in, and appeals on statutory refusals to assess are just dealt with on the papers. You don't have to go to anywhere, you don't have to attend anything, it's done on the papers, and remember 98% of parents are successful. So do not be put off if you're refused at the first stage.
What's the reason that they refuse the application? Because when we apply for it, we feel like our child needs help. So what's the reason they do this?
Well, it varies. It varies. They will give different reasons. Some of them are the myths that Celine's spoken. My view is, I don't know, is that they are refusing to save money because they do not want to carry out the statutory assessment. You as a parent obviously consider that your child needs an EHC assessment. I once dealt with, I've never forgotten it, it'll be in my memoirs if I ever have time. I had dealt with a child with cerebral palsy, non-verbal, age 7, not toilet trained. They refused the statutory assessment. Insane, insane. Of course, appeal was lodged, they immediately gave in.
I've just written down 2 words here, and I don't know if it resonates with people in the room and Beverly and colleagues, but I've just written down gatekeeping. You know, because local authorities unfortunately are so stretched with their resources in terms of, another analogy might be housing, but looking at education law per se, local authorities are going bankrupt and they have to, they think, maintain the status quo and gatekeep, because unfortunately that may mean that people are then forced to appeal. The appeal is then registered, and of course tribunals, which we'll come on to I'm sure, because I've read the slides back in the day, were sort of, oh, we can do this within sort of 8 to 10 weeks, or maybe 16 weeks, as I've seen, but now unfortunately it's up to 52 weeks, which is incredible and insane, because then the local authorities know, well actually, we'll just kick the can down the road to make people appeal, but you need to be steadfast and you need to be dogmatic with it, and local authorities do give in, like Beverly said, once they've seen, well actually, let's look at this with a fresh pair of eyes. Oh crikey, here's all the evidence that's being spoken about. So, to answer your question, I think it is gatekeeping and budgetary protection, which doesn't make it right at all. But anyway, I'll be quiet. So.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I think the reason they refuse initially is because they're trying to save money, not because they're complying with the law, but they're trying to save money, because if they don't carry out a statutory assessment for 12 months, they've saved money.
Could they still refuse against a diagnosis of autism?
Yes. Yeah.
As Beverly said, she's had a child with cerebral palsy, and they said no. Half the time, applicants potentially they don't look at the request; they simply scan through them and issue the no. So they rely on parents not appealing.
I think local authorities absolutely rely on parents not appealing. So don't hesitate to appeal. You will get some local authorities, and I've had it recently, approach parents and say, look, we haven't got much money. You don't want to take money from other children, do you? That's just wrong. And they will try and persuade parents that actually your child's not doing too bad, may have a diagnosis of autism, but actually they're not too bad in mainstream. You don't really need the statutory assessment, so don't hesitate.
And it's only an assessment, isn't it? We're not saying at this stage the HCP is necessary.
Yes.
We're just asking the local authority to assess to determine if it's necessary.
Yes. So this assessment is only an assessment. It doesn't mean you're going to get an EHCP. If you're at the stage of requesting a statutory assessment, you have a long and winding road ahead. A long and winding road, and you have to keep on the tracks. You have to keep on the tracks of that road. At every stage, the local authority are going to try and push you off the tracks.
Okay, so to lodge that appeal, you will need a mediation certificate. When it comes to refusal to assess decisions, if you've got some new evidence between getting a no, it might be worth booking a mediation appointment. However, we usually say call up the mediation service, get your mediation certificate to lodge an appeal, skip the mediation and do straight to appeal. Because as we said, 98% of parents are successful, and by going to mediation, you give the local authority another 2 months to kick the can down the road. If you lodge the appeal, you're in the Send Tribunal's books, then you're on, the local authority have to respond to you. I'm lost in my own book. Okay, so what is an EHC needs assessment? The local authority must obtain advice and information from various professionals. So firstly, they will send you a My Views form, which you will complete with your views of your child's needs. And also your child, if your child is able to express their thoughts, their views are encouraged, it's their plan, so they will also be asked for their views. The local authority will contact your child's school, if they're in one, for their kind of So usually it's a SENCO describing your child's needs. Often, sometimes the SENCO hasn't even met your child. So in terms of school input, it's sometimes more helpful than others. But they will ask for your school's input.
And don't be put off if the school says, we think the child's doing okay, they don't need an EHC needs assessment, because that sometimes happens. Sometimes schools think, even though your child is sat at the back, not learning everything, coming home very anxious, very stressed, very upset, because their needs are not being met, do not be put off, because what happens is a lot of local schools are maintained and run by the local authority. The local authority clearly train and put pressure on SENCOs not to refer for statutory assessments. So just because the SENCO or the teacher says, well, I don't think you'll get a statutory assessment, your child doesn't need an EHCP, actually that's a different question. Whether your child needs an EHCP is not the question about whether you need a statutory assessment anyway. But I once had a case where a head teacher said to a mother, I know your child has some difficulties, but I think we're doing okay, actually. It's okay. You're never going to get an EHCP. Your child doesn't need any further support. It went basically all the way to tribunal. That child not only got an EHCP, they got full-time one-to-one support in the mainstream, because there was clearly that child needed additional support. Yet the head teacher and the SENCO were of the view, this child doesn't need any more support. Don't be put off is the number one rule for your glass of wine tonight.
So the local authority will also arrange an educational psychologist assessment. And their educational psychologist assessment should be the most helpful part of evidence, but this is a local authority employed educational psychologists. So some assessments are better than others, so this is another road barrier that you could face. In terms of the educational psychologist assessments, there's also a shortage. So the local authority will say, well, we don't have an educational psychologist to assess you, we're going to have to wait 2-3 months. In fact, in Bristol, they're telling us they can't assess until October when we applied in June, which is a huge delay, because once you get the EHC needs assessment, so you've had that yes, you're in the EHC needs assessment process, that process takes 10 weeks. The statutory time frame from the beginning to the end of your EHC needs assessment is 10 weeks. So if the local authority are telling you your educational psychologist assessment can't take place until October and you've applied in June, that is wrong. The local authority will be giving their decision for their EHC needs assessment well above the statutory time frame. And that's when we can turn to JR. If we're going over the statutory time frames for things, we can turn to judicial review. We issue what's called a pre-action protocol letter to the local authority to say to them, no, you need to book this educational psychologist assessment, we want a date within 2 weeks, and they have to give you a date for that assessment. So this is when the education law comes alongside the judicial review process, which Greg will be able to answer questions on today.
Can I just say there's been a case in the High Court where a local authority, I can't now remember which one it was, said, sorry, we've got a shortage of educational psychologists, we can't do the assessment within the time limits. And the court said very clearly that is no excuse. That is no excuse. There may be a shortage of educational psychologists, you find it. You find one. You have statutory time limits, you must comply. So don't be put off if the local authority says, sorry, it's a bit of a shortage, a bit of a delay, we'll do what we can. And the High Court, remember, part of the decision says, we're doing our best is not good enough. We're doing our best is not an excuse. Again, don't be put off.
The local authority will also then go to the health department. So they will gather input potentially from your GP, paediatrician, a psychiatrist, or CAMS involved. If CAMS are involved already, they will need to request that those health professionals involved with your child give an input to the statutory assessment. And then social care. As we've said, this is the Children's with Disability team, early help team, or child in need team. It is not safeguarding. So if you're concerned about safeguarding contacting you, they will not. They are not part of the EHC needs assessment process. It's simply the Children with Disability team, usually. And then finally, it might be that you believe your child needs additional input from a professional that's not your GP or an educational psychologist, perhaps your child would be better understood by a speech and language therapist, an occupational therapist, perhaps they've got dyslexia and you want input from an SPLD teacher. In the cases such as these, when you get the yes for your EHC needs assessment, you submit a request for one of these assessments. Any professional assessment that is relevant and can give an accurate depiction of your child's needs must be completed. And if the local authority don't respond to your request, chase them every day. If your child has already had input from a speech and language therapist at the NHS, but perhaps they've been written off 3 years ago, but you still think they need speech and language input, request it as part of the statutory needs assessment. It's similar with occupational therapy. If your child has needs in terms of fine motor skills or gross motor skills, and you think that an educational psychologist isn't going to get the best picture of your child and there's other relevant professional would, during the EHC needs assessment, you can request additional professionals' involvement.
Can I just say that if you have a child who has a diagnosis of autism, or you believe your child has autistic traits and may have those sorts of difficulties, I think you definitely need to be asking for an occupational therapist assessment, because your child is likely to have sensory issues. You probably want a speech and language therapy assessment because your child is likely to have social and communication issues. You'll ask for the educational psychologist as well. You then come on to, I guess, the quality of some of those assessments. Unfortunately, in the NHS, there is a shortage of speech and language, there's a shortage of OTs. If you are able to afford independent reports, it's usually generally worth doing at this stage, because you've got a baseline then. Independent reports, they are expensive, they vary, but they will be much more detailed, and they will be much better on identifying needs and much better on identifying provision. Because the problem with the NHS speech and language reports is it might identify some needs, but they then say, we're not going to do anything because we've got a shortage. And it shouldn't be about what's available, and we'll come on to provision later. But those are the sort of things you might be looking at. And if you have, as I say, if you have any concerns that your child may be dyslexic, then get a specialist assessment on that.
Just on independent professional reports, it might be that you submit an independent professional report during the EHC needs assessment stage, and the local authority refuse to consider it. It's sometimes an internal policy at the local authority, it's unlawful. So if you then need to submit an appeal against them, if you've got a no, detail that independent assessment report in the appeal, because it must be considered by the local authority. In terms of timescales of issuing a plan, as I've mentioned, the local authority has 6 weeks to collate the evidence, so that's from the education psychologist, the health department, social care, and provide a decision as to whether they are going to assess your child. They then have that further 10 weeks to assess. So you've moved through the EHC needs assessment, you've had your education psychologist assessment, and you're at week 16 of the process. At that point, the local authority must confirm to you whether they're going to issue a plan. If at week 16 the local authority have not issued the decision, come to us, as I said, it's a JR matter, a judicial review, there is a remedy. Again, if the local authority have assessed and they say, we are not going to issue with a plan, you have another right of appeal when you get that decision. So when you get a right of appeal, you have 2 months to obtain a mediation certificate. We suggest obtaining that mediation certificate as soon as possible, because you can then lodge an appeal with the Central Tribunal. In terms of refusal to issue decisions, so following the assessment they refuse to issue a plan, the appeal rates for parents are still very high at 87%. So you still have a very good chance of overturning the local authority's decision. And as it says there, refusal to issue an EHCP appeal is more complex. The test is whether it's necessary for special education provision to be made in accordance with an EHC plan. So perhaps you've had an education psychologist assessment by the local authority, it's not very good, they've given you a no. You've got an independent, say, speech and language therapist assessment that says your child needs direct speech and language therapy, and the local authority have ignored that. That's the kind of evidence you want for a refusal to issue a appeal, because it's clear that your child needs additional provision.
I think if you're going to appeal a decision, a refusal to issue an EHC plan, you need to have in mind what additional provision that child or young person needs. So is it one-to-one TA support? And just different local authorities, some of them call them teaching assistants, TAs, some call them LSAs, learning support assistants, some call them something else, I can't remember now. So, but basically the teaching assistant, if your child may not need full-time TA support, but might need it for, say, the literary subjects such as English and history or that sort of thing, but might not need it, say, for PE and art. So you might be looking at, say, 20 hours a week or 15 hours a week. You might be looking at that the child might need to have support at social times, to play times, to encourage them and support them in social interactions. They might need, if they have a physical impairment in any way, they might need the curriculum to be modified. They might need all of the material that is going to be given to them to be modified in some way. So there's also, but have in mind, if it's a refusal to issue, what provision is it that you want that's in addition to say, having in a mainstream school? What is it that you actually want?
Can I just ask, sorry, you know the mediation certificate, do you ever find mediation at all helpful?
The question is, do you ever find mediation helpful? I think that the short answer is no. I think it may be there are some very rare occasions when it is, but there are all sorts of issues with mediation. The first is that often if the local authority pitch up to the mediation, they send someone who does not have the standing to make decisions. So you're saying, this is obvious, this child needs an EHCP plan, and the local authority is saying, well, I hear what you say, I'll go back to panel, or some, panels do my head in. If ever there's a word that I would like to be deleted from the English language, it's a panel, because why do you need a blooming panel who've never met the child to make a decision which they know nothing about? That's my experience of panels. I think also that the local authority come along, and their purpose to mediation is to try and browbeat you into agreeing whatever it is they're proposing in the first place. Now, if you lodge an appeal, that doesn't stop you from continuing to negotiate and discuss matters with the local authority. You still do that. You don't sort of lodge your appeal and that's it. You don't discuss. You continue. From the time, if we're ever involved in the case, from the time we're involved, we're trying to negotiate and discuss with the local authority and try and say to them, you have no case, why don't you give in? You have no case. Or trying to discuss things with them. So my general rule is that mediation only elongates and lengthens the process. Then there may be rare occasions, but I would have thought in over 30 years, there is one case I can think of where mediation was helpful. And I don't know how many cases I've dealt with over 30 years. It's a lot. But generally, it doesn't help any parent, doesn't help a child. And as I say, the local authority never send anybody with any authority to it anyway. It's usually someone who sort of says, oh, just here to take notes or something, it's not helpful. I think also, and mediation companies probably will say I'm wrong here, but they seem to, a lot of the people involved in mediation seem to be very pro local authority. And parents have in the past asked me to attend mediation because and I've gone along. And I have felt that I am absolutely convinced that this parent will be successful at tribunal, and yet the mediator is trying to persuade the parent to back down. And so I find them slightly pro, or slightly is not the word, but I find them pro local authorities because I have been absolutely convinced that this parent's going to be successful. Why would they be backing down? So that's my answer on mediation.
And then finally, you've got to your 16 weeks and perhaps you've got a yes. So all has gone well and you have a yes, they're going to issue the draft EHCP. Unfortunately, that's not the end of your struggles. You might get a draft and it will be woolly, it won't necessarily be helpful. And you have 15 days to go through that plan and respond to the local authority with your amendments that you are seeking. So you've only got 2 weeks.
It is a minimum. If you need longer because you're going to be on holiday or you're stressed trying to deal with a child with special needs who's got no provision or poor provision, you can ask for longer. Remember, it's a minimum. The most extraordinary thing I find is that local authorities frequently fail to keep to time limits, yet when they issue the draft EHCP, they're saying, parents, you've got 15 days, get it back, or, that's it. It's nonsense. If you need longer, just ask for it. It's a minimum, not a maximum.
So when the draft EHCP...
Where do you ask to get longer than 15 days? It's a good question. The answer is, whoever sent you the draft, you reply to that email and say, thank you for your draft email, draft EHCP. I would like longer than 15 days, please, because I think it will take me much longer to go through. Can I please have until X date? And they will, I've never known a local authority say no. So you need to ask.
Okay. So you've got your draft EHCP. When you receive your draft EHCP, it must be issued with all of the documents that are listed in Section K of the plan. So you're turning to Section K, and firstly you're looking for, are all the documents that were gathered as part of the assessment in there? But also, if you've submitted independent reports, and that independent report is not listed in Section K, the local authority has not used it to draft your EHCP, so straight away, a warning bell should be going off in your mind. And when you're amending the plan, you want to be including your independent reports if they're not currently listed in Section K. But what are you looking for in that draft EHCP? The most important sections are Section B and F, which Beverly is going to come on to later, so I won't touch too much on that. But essentially, you want to be looking at Section B, are your child's needs stated accurately? And then Section F in the draft, what provision is actually in that plan? Is it specified and quantified? And I'm going to leave it there because I will be, Beverly will be explaining Sections B and F further. But in terms of the EHC plan, as it says, there's no universal template. Each local authority, each EHC plan looks different in their draft. Each local authority has a different way of approaching things. We've seen rainbow-coloured ones, and we've seen straight boxes of text, size 12 Arial, and it's just listed out for you in bullet points. So there's no one approach to how the draft EHCP looks like, but it's the wording that's important in Section B and F. So.
Can I just say that I cannot tell you how different local authorities produce EHCPs. Each local authority is different in loads of ways. As I say, one has different colours, which blows your mind. Some of them set them out properly with B, all the needs, and then later on F, all the provision. Some of them will do B, they will do a section such as physical and sensory, and then have the provision next to it for physical and sensory. And so they'll go through each category rather than do B and F separate. Don't worry, it doesn't matter how they set it out. It just, if you're looking at EHCPs from different local authorities, sometimes it can blow your mind. Somebody watching on the Facebook has said, what can a parent do when an LEA-EP report is not specific and quantified? That is a very good question, which we will come on to shortly, so do not go away. It comes into the next section. I think we're slightly ahead of time, so before we move on, because then it just allows us more flexibility and questions. Is there anybody that wants a question on how to request an EHC needs assessment, or when you've got, or the refusal to issue an EHC plan? Are we all okay there? I think the things you've got to remember with your glass of wine tonight is that the threshold for getting an EHC needs assessment is very low. Don't be put off. And if you're refused appeal, you're likely to be successful. If you have evidence your child needs additional support, then it's likely they're going to need an EHC plan. So again, if the plan is refused, appeal. Okay. So what we'll do is we're going to stop the recording for a minute, and we will then start again shortly to go, and I'm going to talk about the EHC plan and sections B, F and I.